Hello, folks. It's Bryce Hoffman, host of the Thinking Leader podcast. This week, as world leaders gather in Dubai to discuss the fate of the planet, the climate crisis, for the COP28 summit, I wanted to rebroadcast a conversation I had back in 2022 with a good friend of mine, Michael Kleeman, who talks about what the human race has built is suboptimal. Have a listen, and I think you're going to find it really interesting in light of the conversations underway today in Dubai.
Welcome to The Thinking Leader, brought to you by Red Team Thinking. Bad leaders react, good leaders plan, and great leaders think. Each week, you'll get new ideas and insights from business executives, military experts, and innovative thought leaders to help you lead more effectively and better navigate your complex world.
I am here with an amazing strategic thinker, good friend of mine as well, Michael Kleeman. Michael is a senior fellow at the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy, a member of the research innovation team at George Mason University, and a strategic advisor to the president of the American Red Cross. And these are just the most recent items on his resume, which is one of the most impressive resumes that I have ever read, stretching all the way back to the early days of the internet. Michael, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here, Bryce. Good to see you.
Good to see you. There's so much that we could talk about today. And when you and I talk, we always end up going in interesting directions. But one thing that I think would be really interesting to discuss that's really one of your areas of particular expertise is dealing with problems in complex systems. And we're dealing with a lot of problems in complex systems today. Everything from obviously the global pandemic to the global food supply chain, et cetera, to global warming. Why is it so hard for people to get their heads around addressing these sorts of complex problems?
Well, golly, we're biological creatures, and we at sometimes like to think that we can deal with some really major complexity, but in reality, almost all of our senses and all of our brain structures evolved to deal with pretty local things. There's a concept called the intergenerational discount rate, which says that if anything's 3 or 5 years out, psychologically, we give it no value. And, if you go back 400 years, that makes all the sense in the world, right? If the crop fails this year, maybe I can make it through next year, maybe a year later, but please don't tell me that if I put a seed down in the bank today, 5 years from now, I'll be much better off if I can't feed myself tomorrow. So, and we live in our local communities, we live in our local worlds. And so it's very hard, even for people that travel all around the globe like you do and have worked in lots of places, to really systemically think about things in these multiple contexts. We're just not built for it, frankly.
Well, I wonder, how much is that a cultural thing? Because I know that you have indigenous groups, including some of the Native American tribes, and I believe the Maori in New Zealand as well, that had this concept of making decisions based on 7 generations out, and thinking about the multi-generational consequences of decisions.
Yeah, I think that you're right. What we're seeing primarily is the impact of the dominant, European expansion into most of the rest of the world, taking that over. And, you bring up Maori, and the reality is it took less than 1 generation, I believe, for the Kiwi to become extinct once the Europeans got to New Zealand. And yet they had coexisted with Maori forever. Right. So there is a different perspective, but I think that the reason it's dominant is because it has, if you will, in an environmental sense, or pardon me, an evolutionary sense, beaten out its competitors. That paradigm has largely done it. I think much to the dismay of our culture long term, frankly. I think we're worse for it.
I would agree. I mean, one of the things that we kind of constantly hammer on at Red Team Thinking is thinking long term versus thinking short term. And it's interesting that you say this, because I tend to think, and I think a lot of people probably tend to think, that if they do think about the difference between short term and long term thinking, and the problem of short term thinking is that a lot of our short term thinking is the product of relatively recent developments, like the compensation structure for publicly traded companies that's based on hitting quarterly financial targets. But as you explain this, I think it goes back a bit further than that, then.
Yeah, and there's that's really interesting thing, that how we frame things and the rewards we get change things. The other thing is a point around data. Most people, there's a small percentage of people in the world that have traveled around, seen different cultures, worked in different places, lived with people in different places, right? That's a tiny percentage, and most of us are pretty, in the literal sense, not in a negative sense, parochial.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
particularly
so
in the United States.
In major pockets of the United States. But by the way, it's not just the people that don't live on the coast. I would argue that the people that live in Manhattan and in the summers go to the Hamptons are as parochial as anyone you could think of.
Absolutely.
Right. And if you don't have the data, how can you integrate the information and take a look at a larger systemic view? If you're given this narrow frame, I mean, when you live in a world, I'll take the Hamptons crowd. If you live in a world where it is normal to spend $150,000 on your child's 13th birthday party, I mean, it's just beyond conceptualization. Even if you can afford it, how do you rationalize something like that? But it becomes normative, and so,
right.
and I think that we really don't understand how fragile things are. To your point about just how things have changed, we've built an agricultural system that you alluded to on a global basis only in the last couple hundred years, and it's based upon a period of unusual weather. As you know, the weather has not been as stable as it has been for the last 150 years before that. You look at the ice core drillings and things like that. But we built a global agricultural system, assuming that every August, the temperature is going to be in this tiny range, and we're going to get this much rain, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going back into the normal chaotic system of weather, made worse by global warming, but it was always somewhat chaotic. And I'm very fond of saying the only thing more chaotic than the global weather system is a marriage, right? No, you think, but how predictable? We assume it's not predictable. I mean, how could you have something that big, that complex, with all these different variables, and assume you're going to have the same, within an inch or so, the same amount of precipitation every month in London, for the next 150 years? It's just, it defies logic to think that way.
Right.
But that's what we did. We built an entire global system feeding billions of people based upon that assumption.
Well, it's a lack of resiliency in planning, and a lack of flexibility in the plans we make. We don't create systems that can pivot, that can flex easily.
Right. Yeah. Well, what we've done is we've created a whole series of local optima. Right. We optimize for local situations, and then at a global basis, and I'm not just talking physically global, but overall, right? At a global basis, we create suboptimal systems that are fragile. But we're going to find a way. An example of a local optima is we're going to be a firm that's involved in a value system around food, and I'm going to extract as much financial value as I possibly can out of that. And it doesn't matter if I'm the food processor and retailer. If I take the bulk of the money and leave the farmer with very little, or the endpoint retailer with a little bit less, if I'm that packager, I'm going to take the bulk of it. And that's a local optimization for their good. But the whole value system, you've really created problems there. You wipe out the smaller grocers in some cases who can't afford the price. You really put pressure on farming at a local level. And then all of a sudden, if you don't have the inputs, then everything crashes. But you've made profit in the meantime. And so it's very rare to see anyone along that value system optimize for the whole system cooperatively with all the players. It's really rare.
It is. And one of the things that's always struck me back in my previous life as a business reporter, was the lack of long-term thinking in most Western corporations, but contrasting that with the long-term thinking that does occur in some of the most, respected Asian corporations, particularly Japanese corporations. I'm thinking most pointedly about Toyota. And, Toyota, the first time I met Akio Toyota, he very proudly walked me through Toyota's 100-year plan and explained this is a living document that they update, I believe, every 10 years. And it's something that guides the company's thinking. And when he showed me the document in 1999, the overarching goal for Toyota's 100-year plan was within 100 years, i.e., by the end of 2099, all of their products and everything that they did had to be not just carbon neutral, but net zero everything. So that everything that they extracted from the earth had to be returned to the earth or mitigated. And he explained to me very seriously that he says, this is our goal, because we realize that if 100 years from now, our production, our sales, our operations are still having a net negative impact on the earth, we won't be in business, because people will not accept that 100 years from now. And therefore, we're going to do the following things over the next 100 years. It was a serious thing. It's not for marketing. It's not something they share. It's for internal guidance. But that is incredibly rare.
No, you're right, and I think there's a couple things you said there that strike me. I mean, first of all, the name of the chairman is the same as the name of the firm. This is basically a family firm.
Yeah.
John Wells, who's a good friend of mine and was the president of IMD and at Harvard Business School for a long time, has done this interesting analysis comparing what he calls managerial capital, which is the U.S. system, with family capital, which is what Toyota's like, and then also Hyundai, for instance, in South Korea, and a lot of the European firms. And, they have a totally different perspective. They're part of their communities. They pay their people better. They innovate more, right?
Yes.
They last longer. And the difference is the typical U.S. corporate lead sees themselves in and out of their job in under a decade and tries to optimize for their financial return. And a typical family firm lead sees this as a legacy for their children and their family writ large, not just their immediate family, their business family, their employees, right? They have a totally different view of what it means to be a leader. And, one could argue that the managerial capital model is net destructive of value in the long term, but it optimizes, again, in the short term for maybe 3 or 4 people. By the way, not for shareholders. There's good data that suggests that corporations are not run to maximize shareholder return. Corporations mostly are run to maximize the financial benefit of the 5 senior executives.
That's so interesting that you say that. When I was working on my first book, American Icon, someone who I spent a lot of time with was one of Ford's senior board members who had been the former CEO of Estee Lauder, another family-owned company.
Yeah.
And, when before my book came out, but when it was done and we were chatting, we were talking about, one of the things that he and I talked about is the reason Ford was able to do some of the things that ultimately saved it during the global financial crisis, like bringing in the president of Boeing to run the company, was because even though Ford is a publicly traded company, it's a very unusual one in that, as you know, I'm sure that the family controls the company through super voting shares and can't be diluted. So it really is a family company for all intents and purposes. And, his thesis, and he showed me this at several points, was that it was because it was a family controlled company, they were able to do some of these contrarian sorts of things that Wall Street just wouldn't have tolerated, most likely. And we got to talking about this, and he said, you really should write your next book about, the comparing closely held or family held companies to publicly traded companies. And because I had already come to believe through my business reporting that the public markets have a really negative impact on strategic planning and management.
Sure,
because of the perverse incentives that they create. I pitched that to my publisher, and they said, if you write this book, it'll be the last book you ever write, because you will blacklist yourself.
Yeah. But it's funny. Around 7 years ago, another brilliant man who sadly is no longer with us, named Hal Sirkin, and I were together. And Hal was the senior partner at the Boston Consulting Group, and it was BCG's 50th anniversary. And he said to me, here we have all these amazing corporations with executives being paid millions, in some cases tens of millions of dollars in total compensation. And the best thing they can do to increase company value is buy back shares. I mean, you've got to be kidding me, right? I mean, this is like, what are you getting paid for? So, buying back shares and by the way, they got all this money from the government. A lot of the zero cost money that or very low cost money that corporations got during the financial downturn that went back in to sort of rebuild liquidity in our society, basically went to share buyback as opposed to creating new jobs or innovation, et cetera. And you're going, wow, you get paid for that? I'm sorry, my dog could do that better. That's not leadership. That's greed.
I remember writing a story during the global financial crisis when General Motors went bankrupt. Rick Wagner, the CEO of General Motors at the time, was making double-digit $1 million a year in salary, and if you add in his stock options and everything, a lot more than that. Whereas Akio-san, which was running what was then still, the one of the most profitable automakers in the world, took home $2 million a year, all in.
Yeah. No, it's a matter of balance and how you view your position relative to those around you. I mean, the other thing on the long-term horizon, one of my very favorite examples, there's another colleague who is on the board. I think he's rolled off now, but a wine ownership consortium. They own a lot of wineries, and he gets compensated, but his options don't vest until 2 to 5 years after he leaves the board.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Right. So the decisions he makes have to have long-term value for him to benefit financially.
So it comes down to picking the right incentives in part.
Yeah.
I mean, if you incentivize CEOs, I mean, most CEOs make more in their bonus than they do in their base salary. Yeah. And most bonuses are based on hitting your annual financial numbers. So what's the incentive to plan for the long term?
Right. Right. And the other thing is how you frame the role of the corporation within its society. And, somehow this idea that the purpose of the corporation was to maximize shareholder value, caught on. I think it caught on because it sort of satisfied a lot of people, but I can find nowhere in law or in tablets written down from a mount that say that. I mean, the the corporation exists for lots of different reasons, and the irony is that we have to create a B Corp model, a social benefit corporation model. Says to me that the regular C Corp model was lacking and somehow missing something. That we actually had to be explicit about saying, well, I'm a corporation and I exist to improve the society I'm part of, as opposed, what's the opposite? Does that mean a traditional C Corp doesn't have that responsibility and can be exploitive and destructive of the society that feeds it? I mean, to me, this is an irony. It's like in the research community, we have something called translational research. And translational research is taking things that you do in a laboratory and applying them to the real world. And it suggests to me that we've gotten in the research area, in some cases, so narrowly focused that we actually had to create a new discipline to say, oh, we're going to take these things and apply it so it's got real value. I mean, everything ought to be and not everything.
What a brilliant idea.
Right, but a lot of things ought to be translational by their very nature, right?
Right.
But we had to create a discipline and fund it differently to get that incentive out there. I just think it's fascinating.
Well, this is something I've talked with a lot of our clients over the years about. And it's something I learned from my mentor, Alan Mullally, which is that before you get to strategy, before you get to management, you have to figure out why are you coming to work every day? Mm-hmm. And Simon Sinek talks about this really well with, finding your why and stuff like that. And, when I ask CEOs, what is your why? a shocking number of them over the years have said to me to increase shareholder value. And my response to that is if that's the case, why are you doing whatever you're doing? Why not get into the porn business or the cigarette business? Because it's a much more rapid way to increase shareholder value. If that's all you care about is increasing shareholder value, if that's the reason your company exists, then why are you making tires or making, fill in the blank? Just cut to the chase. Opium worked really well for the British for a long time.
No, and there one could argue the people that run some of the drug cartels are certainly increasing their shareholder value at really high value, really high rates. You're right. No, I think that whole question of framing and what are we here for is really important. And when we look at climate, Toyota's comment I think is prescient, and I would just ask him to think maybe there's one other factor, that if you don't do these things and every other corporation doesn't do these things, you won't have customers. You won't have a customer. You won't have employees. We will have so devastated the environment that supports everything we do that we have no choice, right? And it's enlightened self-interest to do these things.
Well, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the inability to think 3-4 years in advance. Frankly, isn't that what we saw at Glasgow last year? Everyone comes together and says, "Oh my gosh, in 4 or 5 years, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen," and then they make a few modest tweaks to their commitments and get back in their private jets or whatever and fly home.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting challenge. So, one of the areas is, that I spend a lot of my energy is this intersection between the corporate sector and sustainability and environment. I'm not sure what the label ought to be. And, one of the interesting challenges, and I'm certain you've talked to executives about it, and when you discuss this, very often the response I hear is, but I don't know what I can do. I only run this little $10 billion firm. No, seriously, that's a small firm today, right?
Yeah.
What impact can I have? And I think we need to find ways to help empower everybody to understand that everything each one of us does can have a material impact. The things we buy, the things we waste, how we do our planning, how we think about our supply chains, all those things can have an impact. And sometimes we need to create external forces like the move toward, carbon counting and things like that. It's now become increasingly important. But, there are ways you can do things and win by doing the right thing if you're framing it the right way. There's I'm sad that I'm blocking on the guy's name, but he's again no longer with us. The chairman of Interface Carpet, Ray. I'll think of his name. At the break, I'll look it up. But this is a man. Carpet making is a notoriously dirty business. If you think about it, right? It's you make the stuff heavily out of petroleum. 10% of it gets worn. This is industrial carpet, not residential. 10% of it gets worn, and then you rip it all out and throw it all away, and it just goes into landfill, and it's just really not environmentally that good. Ray Anderson was the chairman of Interface. And he was influenced by the thinking of Paul Hawken, and then undertook something that was developed in Scandinavia called the natural step, which basically looks at the world as a closed ecosystem and industry as part of it. And he took all of his people through the training. And he really reshaped the company, became wildly profitable. He helped them reposition in a market driven by architects and designers. He empowered his people. There's this wonderful story how someone had come from another firm to learn about what they were doing, and this woman was in the boardroom and needed to go to the restroom, and the restroom was down on the shop floor, and she's walking across the shop floor and runs across this woman driving a forklift. And she asks her to point her to where the restroom is, and the woman says, "Why are you here?" And they get into a short conversation, and this truck driver, forklift driver starts lecturing her And she's hearing from the forklift driver the same thing she was hearing from the chairman about why it's important, why we build our products a different way, why we think about these things. And then all of a sudden she looked at her watch and said, listen, excuse me, because if I don't move this roll of carpet over to the cutting machine, it's going to screw up the entire production line and it's going to throw all these other people. So please pardon me.
Wow. But see, that's the power of that's the power of real leadership and engagement from the C-suite to the factory floor.
Yeah.
That's so powerful.
And Ray referred to that as love on the shop floor.
I love it. I love it. This is great stuff. Yeah. Let's take a short break. And when we come back, Michael, I want to talk more about how we can start thinking differently, how organizations can start making better decisions when dealing with complex systems. Stay tuned. Hey, folks, Bryce here. If you're listening to this and you're liking what you're hearing and you're wondering, am I a red team thinker? We have an easy way for you to find out. Just go to the show notes, click on the link there to our free assessment to find out if you are a red team thinker and what you can do to think more effectively, to lead more effectively, and to make better decisions faster in your complex world. Like I said, the link is in the show notes, or you can simply go to our website, redteamthinking.com. Check it out. I can't wait to see how you score. Welcome back. So, Michael, we've done a pretty good job of describing the problem. What's the solution?
Well, we have to reframe how we look at the problem space as a society and understand two things, I think. One is that it's not someone else's problem, it's our problem collectively. And it is, if anything ever was an intergenerational problem, this is. I shudder for people being born today about the world that they will grow up in. And it's personal now that I became a grandfather last month.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you, but it's still a mixed blessing, and and my the kids worry about that maybe more than I do. But the other thing I think is, there was a cartoon in the United States called Pogo, and I know you know this one, and there's this famous line from Pogo is, we've met the enemy and they are us.
Yes.
All of us bear a responsibility, and all of us can do something to make a difference. The consumption of resource is driven by the things that we buy. And the consumption of resources is one of the major things that's causing the environmental challenges that we have. When the pandemic started and people stopped driving, all of a sudden three interesting phenomena occurred. One is the air got cleaner.
Yes.
In almost every place around the world. And we had an economic slowdown, and it was devastating to a lot of people, and a lot of people died, and it was tragic. But the other thing is species that we thought were on the brink of extinction started coming back, which shows you that the natural world is phenomenally resilient if we stop pushing it so hard.
Yes.
So everything that we collectively, me, the things I buy, how far I drive, what resources I use, how much water I use, how much electricity I use, every single bit of that matters. And at the corporate level, one really has to wonder, what do I buy? What do I sell? How do I generate value? And what are the long-term systemic costs? And can I really try to frame that and think about what I'm going to do? And if I'm a corporate leader, I would argue that if you are really a leader worth the name being a leader, that you take all of that into account and you say, how do I create a company, or how do I recreate my company so that in 20 years it has a vital place in the marketplace, that it is contributing to the fact that there is a stable economy and society, and that the things that I'm going to be building are going to be valued in 20 years and not disdained. And in many cases, if you're an industrial firm, it'll take you 10 years to turn over your plant base, at least, right? So you should have started thinking about this already. And even if you're a retail firm, it's going to take you 3 to 5 years, to really transform everything. So it is probably too late for almost everybody, but thank goodness from the corporate sense, it's too late for everybody. So we're all on the same ground. But I would start as quickly as I could saying, what should we be? And then there's this wonderful concept called backcasting, right? If I know where I want to end up, what steps do I have to take, each step going backwards to get there?
I love that. Backcasting.
Yeah, backcasting. And I'm indebted to my friend and colleague, Gil Friend, who runs a group called Natural Logic for that. Gil's been doing this for 45 years. He's been a warrior in working with companies to try to do it. But the idea is, think about what you want to be and how would you, as a senior executive of a firm, how would you like to sit down with your grandchildren and say, this is the future I'm going to help bequeath to you? The same way Ray Anderson said, come to work every day, saving the earth, right?
That's
how would you like to feel, right? And I think we can do it. That's the thing. I do believe we are capable of doing it. It'll cause sacrifice. It'll cause economic dislocation. But if we start now, it'll be much less than if it's forced on us.
I think you start to see some companies doing that too. I think Ford, for instance, if you look at what they've done in the past 12 months in terms of production, in terms of, to your point about pain, they just laid off several thousand white collar workers, all whose jobs were centered on internal combustion engines.
That's right.
I think it's very clear if you read the tea leaves that Ford, I don't know what the time threshold is, but certainly within the next 10 years, I would guess, is probably not going to be producing any gasoline or diesel powered vehicles, or at least very few.
Yeah. And it takes courage to do that. And, the reality is those people that are part of the upstream supply chain to Ford on all those components for ICEs, et cetera, really need to be thinking about, where is my future and how do I retool today? And how do I sit down with people like Ford and others and say, I want to be your supplier of the future. What do I have to do? Right? Or gracefully find a way to exit it and utilize the assets and find a graceful way to take care of your employees in the process and rebuild the economic base. And that's something that government needs to contribute to, as well as the corporations.
And also, I can't say what company in this case, because it's a company we've worked with, but, one of the major petroleum companies in the world, I had a conversation 2 years ago with their senior executives, and they said, in 50 years, we will not produce any fossil fuels. Our challenge is, how do we transition without going, without self-destructing over the next 50 years? And they knew what they were going to switch to, hydrogen and wind power and all this stuff like this. But how do we extricate ourselves from the business we've been in for X number of decades? But there are people who are thinking that way. Yeah. Unfortunately, they're not the majority.
They're not the majority, and they're not thinking about their employees and the societies around them. And we have to be thinking that way, because if it'd be fine if and I think the oil company doing that is amazing. But if all they care about is how they're going to get there, but not what happens to the dislocation and the people that all the people that are suppliers and servicers, et cetera, the economic dislocation will be so damaging and so disruptive that, there won't be anyone to buy the cars or buy the products they're making. I mean, one of the brilliant things that Henry Ford did is he was one of the major proponents of this. Was it a 6-day work week or 5-day?
5-day work week.
5-day work week. Yeah. And I'll never forget the quote. And the minimum wage. And the bottom line was, it was enlightened self-interest. If I don't pay people enough, they're not going to be able to afford my cars. And if they don't have time to enjoy them, why would they buy them? So, we need to think that way about how do we play in the larger society, not just how do I make a car that I can make the most profit out of.
So if you're a CEO or a senior leader at a company today, how do you think that way? How do you square that circle? Because on the one hand, you want to move in the right direction, but you also want to protect, to the degree possible, your employees, the communities that your factories and facilities exist in. How do you balance those competing needs?
Well, we can look at what, as you were talking about, firms like Toyota that does work hard to balance those needs. You can understand that it's going to take time to make the transition. And I think that's the most important thing. If you try to think, I have to do it tomorrow, you're going to fail, because no one can do it. No one, it's impossible. How long has Ford been working on this journey? It's over a decade now, at least.
Oh yeah, more than
right.
Yeah,
right. So it's taken a while, and the 150 to me is just an amazing statement and product. The new, I think the Lightning, whatever they're calling the electric.
Yeah.
What a courageous move, right, to do that in so many ways. But it's probably been a decade in the development of it, right? And so understand it's going to take time. Number one, signal to the market that you're doing this. Corporations that have public shareholders need to alter their shareholder base so that ultimately the shareholders are in line with what the firm is doing and they don't end up with backlashes.
That's a really interesting concept that I've never heard anybody talk about. It's getting the shareholders that are aligned with your vision.
Yeah, I mean, the example I can give you is when the telephone companies in the 1980s went through deregulation and they started moving largely to become mobile rather than fixed line. And as you know, that's an industry I spent a lot of my life in. One of the things we discussed with them, and I was a consultant at the time, was, you have a shareholder base who is used to a dividend model of income.
Right.
Now, Verizon still has that, but I would argue most people don't buy Verizon as a dividend stock. It's just a legacy. You buy it as a growth stock. And so it's a different community of investors. And so what you need to do is signal it early. And that takes time for especially institutional investors to begin to move the stock into a different category and think about it differently. But then when you start making these changes, you already have the kinds of investors that think the way you want to, as opposed to fighting you. And I think that's important. And you need to signal to your employees the same thing.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, Michael, because one of the things that I've talked with Alan Mullally a lot about over the years is, because he's been very generous to mentor me over the years. When I've had CEOs who know they need to do something big to change their direction, but then they say, we can't do this because the market, the investors will go against us, Wall Street will turn against us. And I've sat with Alan, I've said, what would you tell this person? And he always gets a big smile and he says, that's your job as the CEO, though. You have no more important job than to tell the company's story. And he said, if you do a good job of telling the story, of crafting the narrative, you'll bring Wall Street around. And his example of it, which was amazing, was when he was still CEO of Ford, they switched the F-150 to aluminum. And as I'm sure you know, you can't build an aluminum truck on an assembly line that's designed to build a steel truck. And so the only way they were going to be able to do this was to shut the assembly lines down for, I think it was about 10 months. And the F-150 is not only Ford's most profitable vehicle, it's the best-selling car in the world, best-selling vehicle in the world. So, when they proposed this, and this is something Alan proposed early on because he came from Boeing and said, we need to lighten these vehicles is the easiest way to reduce fuel consumption, coming as an aerospace engineer. And everyone said, we can't do that. We can't stop producing our best-selling vehicle for 10 months. Wall Street will crucify us. And his point was, no, they won't. Not if we explain to them why we're doing it. And so what he did, and what he said his job as a CEO was to go to Wall Street and to sit with all the big banks and all the major firms and say, listen, this is what we're going to do. Yes, our sales are going to plummet, but here's what's going to happen as a result. A year and a half from now, you're going to see us blow ahead of every other pickup maker in the world, because we're going to have by far the most fuel efficient pickups in the world. And the only way that's going to happen is doing this. And he said, nobody stamped their feet and said, no, you have to keep selling these pickups. They listened and then they're like, yeah, wow, that's amazing. That's great. And so if you look at what happened when Ford did that, when they announced it, they were very transparent. They said, our sales are going to tank. You're going to see at least 3 quarters of really bad sales. but this is why we're doing it. And their stock price went down a little bit, but not a lot, not proportionate to the decline in sales.
Sure.
And when the aluminum F-150 launched, it soared.
Yeah.
And that's all about telling the story.
No, and that's the role of leaders, right? And Gil Friend also has this wonderful model. He says, I'll sit down with people and we'll discuss where you need to be, and people come up with 30 objections. I can't do it because. And he says, to me, that's the punch list of what things you have to address. The market won't respond well. Okay, how do we address that? Oh, we have to do this kind of retooling. We have to change our upstream suppliers. Okay, what do we have to do that, right? And you go through all the problems, and they're not barriers, they're opportunities, and they're things you have to address. And
Right.
if we let them be barriers to change, well, any organism that doesn't grow and change dies. Full stop, right? We know that. And so what you need to do is figure out, how do you adapt? And these kinds of, I can't do it because, to me, is a punch list of adaptation issues. And it's opportunity. So good leaders need to, and the other thing is, good leaders need to pick their teams well and trust and delegate and not try to over control.
Right.
These are really complex problems. No one person can think them through. And a collective group is much better. And, Toyota is another perfect example. If you want to talk about collective management, it goes down to the person on the line.
Right.
Right.
Being able to pull the stop lever.
Right. And it changes the entire psychology of the firm, and then everyone is engaged. When I was doing natural step training with a major supplier to the packaged good industry, we wanted to train everybody in this. And one of the senior executives says, why don't we just train our designers and the other things? And I said, well, exactly the Toyota model. And he said, the bulk of the innovation is not going to come from someone in headquarters. It's going to come from someone on the line who sees something and says, wow, if I reframe the question, shouldn't we be doing it this way? And if you empower those people, what you can create is almost unlimited. And to me, that's always the most exciting part, is when you get with people on the line and you give them a little bit of authority and they just take it and run.
Well, that's it. People want to have agency.
Yeah.
They want to be engaged. And when you give them a little bit of that, as you say, it unlocks their innate creativity, their innate talent. First time I went to Toyota City, I was being given a tour of one of their factories. And the plant manager very proudly at the end of the tour took me into a side building where he had a series of devices for the assembly line, mm-hmm. none of which used electricity, all mm-hmm. of which operated on gravity. And he explained, this is a big part of our initiative to reduce our energy consumption, our carbon footprint, is to figure out ways on the assembly line that we can have our machines operate without electrical power, either mm-hmm. through gravity or through some other means. And I said, this is brilliant. Who came up with these? And he said, these were our workers came up with these. Yeah. And he said, as you know, they have a program to incentivize workers on the assembly line to come up with innovations. And I said, well, that's amazing. What did they get? At the time in the conversion rate between the yen and the dollar, and he said they get $500. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like a lot of money. And he said, the point isn't about the money. It's about the pride. And he said, do you know when they do this? And I said, no. I was starting to wonder, how do you have time to do this? He said, they come in on the weekends and evenings and mm-hmm. work on this together, unpaid. Mm-hmm. And he says, no one's telling them they have to. And it's going to, yes, they'll get $500, but they're not going to get a promotion because they're assembly line workers. Mm-hmm. They do it because they've been given a say in this and they take pride in it. He said, those workers, when they come to work and one of these machines is on the assembly line, they proudly point this out to their coworkers. Everyone knows that they helped build this and stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's what human beings want at a certain level beyond, just the basic, foundations of Maslow's hierarchy.
Pay me enough. So as you're saying, I'm not worried, right? A living wage is what people refer to it. Pay me a little bit more than that because it shows that you respect me, but then acknowledge me, treat me as a human being. let me have degrees of freedom and let me have my pride. And I think we have, as a society, ripped away people's pride so much, and we forget that money cannot substitute for that. And that most people really, we're social creatures, right? We want to be seen, we want to be liked, we want to be respected, and we want to feel like we matter. And that's personal as well as in the business place. We all want to think that what we do matters in life. And if we reduce people to being simply a cog in a wheel or a drone, and by the way, you want to avoid unionization, or you want to cause unionization movements, treat people like crap. Treat them like drones, right? Do what some firms have done recently. You want to avoid it, empower them. And by the way, people will trade off money for a lot of not intangibles in an organization. Security is one of them, right? Respect. And I think it's an important lesson. We can do it. I think we can make the changes we need to do. The only thing I would say is we ran out of time 20 years ago. So the other thing I'd say for any corporate leader is you need to look at this with a sense of urgency that you have to start now. And that means this 10-year cycle, 20-year cycle planning. You need to do it yesterday, if not right now. And then be willing to, as was done at Ford with the 150, make hard choices, signal them, get people on board, and move forward. And if you make mistakes, learn from them and adjust quickly, adapt and renew, because this is going to be a time of radical experimentation. Because, all the old rule books just aren't going to apply the same way they did in the past.
That's great advice, Michael. Hey, you've given people so much to think about. You've given me so much to think about. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
It's great to see you again. I hope to catch up soon. Come visit.
Thanks. I will.
Take care.